The year is 1919. The Great War, a conflict of unprecedented scale and devastation, has finally drawn to a close, leaving behind a scarred and grieving Europe. In the opulent Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, a treaty is signed meant to end the war and forge a lasting peace. This was the Treaty of Versailles. However, instead of healing, its terms would sow the seeds of future conflict. It imposed upon a defeated Germany conditions so severe, psychologically crushing, economically crushing, destabilizing the nation for 2 decades. Understanding this period is crucial, not to excuse what came next, but to comprehend the precarious environment in which they took root. It is a stark lesson in how the aftermath of war can be as consequential as the war itself. Post-war Germany, a nation grappling with defeat, humiliation, profound hardship. The treaty's architects acted from righteous anger, fear of future German aggression, and pressure from bereaved populations, producing a peace that felt like punishment. At the very heart of the Treaty of Versailles lay Article 231. Article 231 would become known as the War Guilt Clause. This single clause was arguably the most psychologically damaging part of the entire document. It forced Germany and its allies to accept full and sole responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the First World War. For a nation that had sacrificed millions of its sons, believing it was fighting a defensive war, this was a profound humiliation. The War Guilt Clause was not merely a symbolic stain, it was the legal foundation for reparations. The reparations were financial payments demanded by the Allied powers to cover the vast expenses of rebuilding their war-torn lands. The final sum, set in 1921, was a staggering 132 billion gold marks. John Maynard Keynes was among those who warned it couldn't be paid, ensuring that any hope of a swift post-war recovery was extinguished before it could even begin. Every tax they paid, every hour of labor they performed. Beyond the financial and moral burdens, the Treaty of Versailles physically dismembered the German Empire. Germany ceded roughly 13% of its European territory. For many Germans, this felt like an amputation of the fatherland. The losses were not only an insult to pride, but an economic blow. The treaty stripped away assets while demanding huge reparations. Germany was asked to pay while losing the means to pay. A vicious circle. On top of land loss, Germany faced strict military restrictions. The army was cut to 100,000 men. Conscription was abolished. Germany was forbidden an air force and tanks and submarines. The Rhineland was to be permanently demilitarized. For a people with a strong military tradition, this was a deep humiliation. Even before the Treaty of Versailles was signed, the German population had been subjected to years of intense suffering due to the Allied naval blockade. Implemented during the war to starve Germany of essential resources, the blockade was devastatingly effective. Crucially, the blockade was not lifted immediately after the armistice in November 1918. It was maintained for several more months, until June 1919, as a means of forcing Germany to accept the treaty's harsh terms. Adding to the national humiliation was the occupation of the Rhineland. The presence of foreign soldiers was a constant, visible reminder of defeat and powerlessness. It created daily friction and tension. Imagine a world where the money in your pocket becomes worthless in a matter of hours. This was the reality for Germans during the hyperinflation crisis of 1923. The result was a catastrophic collapse in the value of the German mark. Prices for everyday goods began to skyrocket, not just daily but hourly. The currency had effectively lost its meaning. It wiped out the savings of an entire social class. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day, so they could rush to the shops before they lost all value. The visual absurdity of the period became legendary. This bizarre and terrifying reality destroyed faith not only in the economy, but also in the government that had allowed it to happen. It fostered a deep-seated fear of economic instability that would linger for generations. The memory of the wheelbarrow full of worthless money became a powerful symbol of the Weimar Republic's failure. Yeah. Just as Germany seemed to be finding its feet in the mid-1920s, in October 1929, the stock market in New York crashed. The flow of American capital, the lifeblood of Germany's fragile recovery, was abruptly cut off. Without this foreign capital, German industries, which had only just begun to recover, ground to a halt. The result was a massive and terrifying wave of unemployment. This second economic catastrophe in less than a decade was a crushing blow to the German people. For millions, the Great Depression was a final confirmation that the Weimar system was incapable of providing basic economic security. The image of a long queue of unemployed German men captures this grim reality. They turned away from the democratic center and towards the political extremes. These parties thrived on the chaos, promising work, bread, and pride. For the average German family in the 1920s and early 1930s, life was a constant fight to survive. The money problems weren't just big ideas, they were real every day. People felt it in their empty stomachs and their cold homes. When money lost its value super fast, food became impossible to get. Families had to make really hard choices. Being poor like this made people feel even worse because they also felt like their country was being shamed. Seeing foreign soldiers in their land, knowing their own army was much weaker than before, always having to pay back money, all made them feel like a beaten and controlled people. For a young person growing up in Germany then, the future looked bad. This deep emotional need was like dry wood that the fires of extreme ideas would light. In a society saturated with hardship and humiliation, extremist ideologies find fertile ground. These groups skillfully channeled anger and resentment towards clearly defined enemies. They relentlessly attacked the Treaty of Versailles, promising to tear it up. They blamed the weakness of the Weimar politicians. They claimed Germany had been stabbed in the back by internal enemies. While the democratic parties seemed paralyzed and ineffective, others projected dynamism, strength, and decisiveness. It offered a psychological balm for wounds of defeat and humiliation. The economic hardships provided the most powerful recruiting tool. They were masters of political theatre, tapping fears, resentments, and longings of a broken nation at a moment of profound crisis. In retrospect, it is clear that the Treaty of Versailles, while intended to secure peace, contributed to the instability that plagued Germany. War guilt clause, crippling reparations, territorial losses, military humiliation created a perfect storm of economic hardship and national resentment. These conditions did not make the rise of Nazism inevitable, but they made it possible. However, to understand these causes is not and must never be to excuse what came next. The suffering of the German people after World War I is a historical reality, but it does not absolve the Nazi regime and those who supported it. Hardship can explain why people make desperate choices, but it cannot justify choices that are fundamentally evil. The chain of historical causation is complex, but the line of moral responsibility is clear. The Allied leaders were not villains. They sought security and justice, yet overlooked how despair can fuel new dangers. This chapter teaches that peace must include recovery, or it may fail to be peace at all. It teaches us to be wary of simplistic narratives and to look for the root causes of political instability. It shows how economic despair can make populations vulnerable to the poison of demagoguery and hate. When people feel the system has failed them, that their future is hopeless and their dignity stolen, they become susceptible to leaders who offer easy scapegoats and radical, violent solutions. Remembering Versailles is not about pointing fingers, but about protecting peace and democracy. We share responsibility to guard against politics of anger, fear, and resentment wherever and whenever they arise. Understanding these conditions provides insight into the interwar period, but it does not justify the actions of the Nazi regime that followed.